The Zlothian Empire had conquered 147 worlds, using what their military strategists proudly called the most efficient method in galactic history. Not a single shot fired, not one casualty, not even a strongly worded complaint filed with the Intergalactic Ethics Committee. Their secret? They simply asked very, very nicely. Well, that and the 40-mile-wide death machines hovering ominously above major population centers. Commander Supreme Blixnorp adjusted his ceremonial conquest sash for the 148th time this cycle and gazed upon his pristine record with the sort of satisfaction usually reserved for beings who had just discovered the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, and found it to be surprisingly reasonable. His method was foolproof, his results were flawless, his ego was approximately the size of a small moon and growing larger by the day. "Magnificent," he bellowed to his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Wimselberry, whose name was unfortunately not his fault, but rather the result of his parents' inexplicable fondness for Earth confectionery they'd never actually tasted. 147 worlds, each one surrendering before tea time. The efficiency reports practically write themselves. Wimselberry, who had learned long ago that contradicting his superior was roughly as healthy as juggling live antimatter while riding a bicycle through a supernova, nodded enthusiastically. "Indeed, sir, the Department of Conquest Optimization has already nominated you for the Golden Subjugation Award 3 consecutive times. They've even commissioned a statue of you crushing a small planet underfoot, sir. Very artistic." "As it should be," proclaimed Blixnorp, puffing out his chest with such vigor that 3 decorative medals popped off and went careening around the bridge like metallic pinballs. "I have perfected the art of warfare by eliminating the war entirely. Future military historians will weep at my genius." But there was a problem brewing in the depths of space, and like most problems in Douglas Adams' universe, it was both completely predictable and utterly absurd. The problem, in this case, was that the Zlothian Empire had become so good at conquering things that they had forgotten to check whether the things they were conquering actually wanted to be conquered or were just being polite. The Zlothian Conquest Manual, Volume 42, Subsection J, clearly stated that civilizations fell into one of 3 categories: those who surrender immediately, approximately 87% of known species; those who surrender after mild intimidation, roughly 11%, and those who are too primitive to understand they should surrender, but do so anyway. Once you explain it slowly, the remaining 2%, mostly consisting of civilizations that communicated primarily through interpretive dance or aggressive vegetable arrangement. The manual had been written by the brightest minds in the Empire, peer-reviewed by committees of committees, translated into 47 different languages, including ancient bureaucratic and modern pedantic, and tested on precisely 0 species that had ever heard of the concept of bloody-minded stubbornness. Which brings us to Earth. The initial scans of the 3rd planet in the Sol system were, frankly, encouraging. The inhabitants appeared to be reasonably intelligent bipeds who had mastered fire, agriculture, the wheel, and the inexplicable art of reality television. They showed all the standard signs of a civilization ripe for polite conquest. Governments that argued among themselves, armies that spent most of their time polishing things, and what appeared to be an unhealthy obsession with small rectangular devices that they stared at for 17 hours a day. "Perfect," declared Blixnorp, reviewing the reports while lounging in his ergonomic conquest chair, which was designed to provide optimal back support during lengthy intimidation sessions. "Standard Class C civilization, probably surrender before lunch. I do so love it when they surrender before lunch. More time for my afternoon meditation on the inherent superiority of the Zlothian way, followed by my evening reflection on why everyone else is inferior." Knee. The scouting report, filed by junior analyst Bobbleworth, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic optimism, wrapped in the sort of confident certainty that could only come from someone who had never actually met a human being. Species exhibits typical pre-conquest behavior patterns, including recreational warfare, territorial disputes over imaginary lines, and an apparent willingness to argue about literally anything. Recommendation: deploy standard intimidation protocol Alpha 7. Estimated time to surrender: 14 minutes, 23 seconds. Margin of error plus or minus 30 seconds for translation delays. What Bubbleworth had failed to mention in his report, because it didn't fit neatly into any of the standard categories on Form 23B, analysis of primitive civilizations and their inevitable capitulation, was that humans possessed a peculiar trait that had never been encountered in the previous 147 conquests. They had a word for it in several languages, but the English version was particularly apt: spite. This was not the sophisticated philosophical spite of advanced civilizations who carefully considered the long-term ramifications of their petty grudges. This was raw, unfiltered weapons-grade spite that could power small suns and had once caused a human to spend 17 years building a spite fence just to annoy a neighbor who had complained about his lawn. The Zlothian fleet arrived on a Tuesday, which was humanity's first mistake. Had they chosen literally any other day of the week, the subsequent events might have unfolded with at least a veneer of dignity. Monday would have found humans too depressed to properly respond to conquest. Wednesday through Friday would have been business as usual. Saturday might have resulted in confused aliens being invited to backyard barbecues. Sunday would have involved churches praying for the aliens' souls, while simultaneously organizing casserole deliveries. But Tuesday was the day that 67-year-old Meredith Crankshaw of Poughkeepsie, New York, was trying to return a defective toaster to the department store where she'd purchased it 6 months earlier, armed with nothing but a receipt, righteous indignation, and 37 years of experience dealing with customer service representatives who had apparently been trained by sadistic dolphins. Meredith had already spent 47 minutes on hold listening to music that sounded like cats drowning in honey, been transferred to 4 different departments: kitchen appliances, returns, warranties, and something called Customer Retention Specialist Training Division, and was currently explaining to a customer service representative named Chad why it's not supposed to shoot sparks, dear, unless you're running some sort of fireworks store, which I very much doubt, when the massive Zlothian mothership blotted out the sun above her local mall. The Zlothians, following protocol to the letter with the sort of rigid adherence to procedure that would have made a tax auditor weep with joy, began their standard intimidation display. The ship's external speakers, capable of producing sound at volumes that could liquefy limestone, and had once been used to convince a particularly stubborn asteroid to change its orbit, thundered across the city with a message that had been carefully crafted by the Department of Psychological Warfare and focus-tested threats. Attention, primitive beings of the third planet. You have been selected for integration into the glorious Zlothian Empire. Please prepare for immediate and unconditional surrender. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Meredith, who had spent 3 decades married to Herbert Crankshaw and was therefore immune to loud, unreasonable demands, excessive repetition, and the general assumption that volume could substitute for logic, simply pressed the phone closer to her ear and continued her conversation. Now, listen here, Chad. I don't care if it's been 6 months. I don't care if your warranty department thinks I've been using it to toast meteorites. A toaster should not require a fire extinguisher to operate safely, and it certainly shouldn't make that noise. What noise, Mom? Asked Chad, who was beginning to suspect that this was going to be one of those calls. You know, the noise. Screech, pop, bang. Like a banshee having an argument with a firecracker. No toaster should sound like that, Chad. No toaster in the history of toasters. The Zlothians, interpreting this as some sort of primitive communication ritual possibly involving the summoning of their war gods, decided to clarify their position. They activated their secondary intimidation protocol, causing the mothership to pulse with an ominous red light while emitting what their cultural anthropologists assured them was a deeply unsettling harmonic frequency that would tap into the primal fears of any rational being. The harmonic frequency, as it happened, was remarkably similar to the sound Herbert Crankshaw made when he was trying to fix the garbage disposal after forgetting to turn off the power. Meredith didn't even notice. "Surrender is inevitable," the speakers boomed, now augmented with subsonic bass notes that made windows rattle and small dogs hide under furniture. "Resistance is futile. Your compliance will be noted in your permanent record." Meredith finally looked up from her phone call, squinted at the massive alien vessel hovering approximately 300 feet above the Spencer's Gifts, and made a sound that can only be described as the verbal equivalent of a paper shredder encountering a tax audit. "Oh, for the love of... Chad, I'm going to have to call you back. Some idiots double-parked their flying saucer in the handicapped zone." She marched directly toward the center of the mall parking lot, her sensible walking shoes clicking against the asphalt with the sort of determined rhythm usually associated with executioners or people who had spent 47 minutes on hold and were not going to be dismissed by anyone, regardless of their planet of origin or the size of their spaceship. Where a smaller Zlothian craft had landed to facilitate what their manual optimistically called gracious acceptance of new management, Commander Blixnorp himself had descended to personally oversee what he expected to be another flawless surrender ceremony. He had even brought his ceremonial conquest banner and a small camera crew to document the historic moment for the Zlothian Military Channel's hit show, Worlds That Knew What Was Good for Them. Standing 7 feet tall in his ceremonial armor, which had been polished to a mirror finish and was adorned with medals representing every successful conquest in Zlothian history, flanked by 2 honor guards who looked like they'd been carved from particularly intimidating rocks and backlit by the intimidating glow of his ship's engines, Blixnorp cut an impressive figure. His voice, amplified through his suit's speakers and processed through 17 different vocal enhancement filters, carried all the authority of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who wasn't immediately thereafter vaporized, relocated to a different galaxy, or enrolled in a comprehensive re-education program. "Primitive creature," he declared, his voice echoing across the parking lot with enough reverb to make a cathedral jealous. "I am Commander Supreme Blixnorp of the Zlothian Empire, conqueror of 147 worlds, Master of the Void, bringer of inevitable submission. You will bow before my obvious superiority and formally surrender your pathetic civilization." Meredith looked him up and down with the sort of expression she usually reserved for telemarketers, her nephew's unfortunate choice in girlfriends, and people who insisted on paying for groceries with checks in the express lane. It was a look that had withered stronger beings than Blixnorp, though admittedly most of them had been human and therefore susceptible to the particular brand of disappointed authority that comes naturally to women who have spent decades organizing church bake sales and PTA meetings. "Honey," she said, in a tone that could have flash-frozen a small comet, "I've been dealing with blowhards since before you were a gleam in your daddy's optical sensor. You want to conquer Earth? Get in line. Aji." And then she did something that had never, in the entire history of Zlothian conquest, ever happened before. Something so unprecedented that it wasn't covered in any manual protocol or emergency procedure. Something that would later require the Department of Impossible Scenarios to create an entirely new filing system. She walked away, not running in terror, not falling to her knees in surrender. Not even asking what the paperwork requirements were for planetary subjugation or whether there was a customer service department she could speak to about filing a complaint. She simply turned around and walked back toward the mall, muttering something about, "Damn aliens think they can just show up anywhere without an appointment, and probably don't even have a permit for that thing." Blixnorp stood there for several long seconds, his brain attempting to process this unprecedented turn of events, with all the success of a goldfish trying to understand quantum mechanics. His training had prepared him for weeping, for begging, for elaborate surrender ceremonies involving the ritual burning of national flags and the presentation of ceremonial keys to the planet. He had protocols for dealing with beings who surrendered in languages he didn't understand, species that communicated through color changes, and civilizations that insisted on surrendering through interpretive dance. But casual dismissal, nobody had mentioned casual dismissal in the manual. There wasn't even a footnote about casual dismissal. It was as if the entire concept had never occurred to anyone in the Department of Conquest Strategy, which, considering their track record, was entirely possible. Said Blixnorp, his voice cracking slightly like a teenager asking someone to prom. "Excuse me, primitive creature. I believe you may have misunderstood the nature of this interaction." Meredith paused at the mall entrance, next to a decorative planter that held the sad remains of what had once been petunias, and turned back with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow houseplant. "Listen, sweetie, I'm sure whatever little space tantrum you're having is very important to you, but I've got a toaster situation that takes priority. If you want to conquer something, maybe start with that pothole on 5th Street. Lord knows, the City Council's been ignoring that for 3 years, and it's a genuine hazard to navigation." She disappeared into the mall, leaving behind 3 of the galaxy's most feared conquerors standing in a parking lot like extremely overdressed tourists who'd lost their guidebook and were beginning to suspect they'd gotten off at the wrong planet. The honor guards looked at their commander with expressions that suggested they were beginning to question their career choices. One of them, Senior Guard Bimplethorpe, whose job it was to look intimidating while carrying the ceremonial sword of inevitable submission, cleared his throat with the sort of delicate cough usually employed when one needed to point out that the Emperor was not only naked, but also standing in a rainstorm. "Sir," he ventured carefully, "should we follow her?" "Follow her?" Blixnorp repeated, his voice climbing octaves. "Follow her where? Into the... He gestured helplessly at the mall entrance. "What is that place?" "According to our scanners, sir, it appears to be some sort of large enclosed marketplace. Preliminary analysis suggests it contains approximately 47 different retail establishments, 3 food courts, a movie theater, and something called a Spencer's Gifts that our computers refuse to catalogue for reasons of public decency." "She's shopping!" Blixnorp shrieked, his voice reaching frequencies that made nearby car alarms go off in sympathy. "We just offered to conquer her planet, and she's going shopping." The news of the encounter spread through Earth's communication networks with the sort of viral enthusiasm usually reserved for videos of cats doing improbable things, dogs who could apparently do calculus, and politicians saying something that wasn't immediately contradicted by footage from the previous week. Within 6 hours, every major news organization on the planet was running footage of a senior citizen telling the supreme commander of an alien armada to essentially buzz off and take a number. The hashtag Reach Meredith vs Aliens was trending worldwide within 3 hours, with over 14 million posts ranging from supportive messages, "You go, Meredith," to helpful suggestions, "Maybe they just need better customer service training," to entrepreneurial opportunities, "I'm starting a GoFundMe to buy Meredith a better toaster." The Zlothian High Command, monitoring these transmissions from their orbiting fleet through an array of communications equipment that could intercept carrier pigeon messages from 3 galaxies away, found themselves facing their first genuine crisis in over 2 centuries. Emergency meetings were called, committees were formed. The manual of conquest was consulted with increasing desperation. The Department of Impossible Scenarios was asked to work overtime, and their computers promptly suffered what could only be described as digital nervous breakdowns. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Wimselberry, his voice carrying the sort of barely controlled panic usually associated with discovering that one's parachute is actually a decorative napkin and the ground is approaching with unseemly haste. The human response to our initial contact attempt appears to be unconventional. Blixnorp was pacing the bridge of his flagship with the manic energy of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the universe was not only wrong, but embarrassingly so. His pristine conquest record was developing what could charitably be called a blemish, and what could more accurately be called a crater the size of his ego. "Define unconventional, Lieutenant," he snarled, though the effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that his voice still cracked occasionally from shouting at a parking lot. "Well, sir, according to our monitoring stations, the humans are laughing at us." "Laughing!" Blixnorp's voice reached frequencies that made the bridge's crystal formations ring like wind chimes in a hurricane. "That's impossible. They should be cowering. They should be preparing surrender documents. They should be organizing parades in our honor. They should be building statues of me." "Yes, sir, that was our expectation as well. However, it appears that the human-designated Meredith Crankshaw has become what they call a meme. Our Cultural Analysis Division reports that her dismissal of your conquest announcement has been viewed approximately 47 million times and counting. The number is growing exponentially. A meme? What in the name of the 17 sacred conquest protocols is a meme? According to our research, sir, it's a unit of cultural transmission that spreads from person to person within a culture through repetition and imitation. In this case, the humans appear to be sharing and celebrating the concept of telling authority figures to, and I quote the translation computers here, "stuff it." Now Blixnorp's eye stalks drooped with the sort of dejection usually reserved for houseplants that had just been informed they were going to be replanted in the Sahara Desert during a drought. This was not going according to plan. This was not going according to any plan. This was not even going according to the emergency backup plans that were kept in a sealed vault marked "only open in case of impossible scenarios" and guarded by beings who had been specifically trained to recognize impossible scenarios and had never once had to open the vault. "What else are they saying about us?" he asked weakly. Wimslebury consulted his tablet with the expression of someone who would rather be reading his own obituary. "Well, sir, there's a popular video compilation called Top 10 Signs Your Alien Invasion Needs Better Planning. We're currently ranked at number 3, just behind the Martians who landed in Antarctica by accident and the Galactic Empire that forgot to account for daylight saving time. Number 3, there's also a growing petition to have you included in something called Cosmic Fails, sir. It currently has over 2 million signatures. The humans, meanwhile, were handling the arrival of their would-be conquerors with characteristic ingenuity and a level of bureaucratic sophistication that would have impressed the Swiss, terrified the Germans, and caused the French to spontaneously applaud. Earth's leaders had hastily assembled what they optimistically called a First Contact Response Committee, which consisted of representatives from the United Nations, several military advisors, 2 xenobiologists who had spent their careers studying things that didn't exist, and Dr. Cornelius Bumblebottom, the world's foremost expert on xenological protocols, who had earned his degree from a university that existed primarily in his imagination, but had accredited itself very thoroughly. Dr. Bumblebottom was the sort of person who could make a 3-hour presentation about the proper way to introduce yourself to a potentially hostile alien species, complete with PowerPoint slides, footnotes, and a bibliography that referenced books that wouldn't be written for another century. He wore bow ties that had achieved independent consciousness and harbored secret ambitions of academic advancement, and he carried a briefcase that contained emergency protocols for situations ranging from aliens who communicate through scent To extraterrestrial beings who consider mathematics offensive, the situation is quite clear, announced Dr. Bumblebottom to the assembled delegates, adjusting his entirely decorative spectacles with the sort of authority usually reserved for people who actually knew what they were talking about. These Zlorthians appear to operate under the assumption that conquest is a matter of polite negotiation combined with overwhelming displays of technological superiority. Fascinating. Their methodology suggests a civilization that has never encountered what we might call administrative resistance. General Patricia Ironside, who had spent 30 years dealing with military bureaucracy and was therefore uniquely qualified to understand the psychology of beings who expected immediate compliance with unreasonable demands, nodded grimly. She had once spent 6 months trying to get approval for a new coffee machine in the officer's mess and had emerged from the experience with a deep understanding of how paperwork could be weaponized. So what you're saying is they've never tried to get a permit renewed at the DMV, she said. Precisely, beamed Dr. Bumblebottom, his bow tie practically vibrating with excitement. I propose we respond to their conquest attempt using humanity's most refined and devastating weapon, bureaucracy. And so began what historians would later call the Great Administrative Standoff of 2024. The humans, rather than mounting a military resistance that would have played right into Zlorthian expectations, did something far more insidious. They began treating the alien invasion as a customer service issue. Within 24 hours of first contact, Earth had established the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs, complete with office hours, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., closed for lunch. A complaint filing system that required forms to be submitted in triplicate, and a waiting room with uncomfortable chairs, magazines from 2003, and a water cooler that had been broken since the Carter administration. Any alien wishing to conquer Earth would need to fill out Form 27B, Request for Planetary Subjugation, provide 3 references from previously conquered civilizations, submit to a background check that could take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, and wait for approval from a committee that met every other Thursday unless there was a holiday, in which case they rescheduled for the following month. The Zlorthians, who had expected either immediate surrender or glorious battle, found themselves instead facing the one enemy their military training had never prepared them for: middle management. "I don't understand," wailed Blixsnorp to his communications officer during what had become a daily crisis meeting. "We've sent 17 different surrender demands, each one more intimidating than the last. We've increased the volume, we've added more reverb, we've even included dramatic lighting effects." "Yes, sir," replied communications specialist Twiddlebump, whose name was beginning to seem less unfortunate by comparison to recent events. "However, the humans keep responding with automated messages informing us that our requests have been forwarded to the appropriate department for review." "What department?" "The Department of Hostile Takeover Assessment, sir. Apparently all conquest attempts must be evaluated for compliance with local zoning laws, environmental impact requirements, and something called proper notification procedures." Blixsnorp made a sound like a deflating balloon attempting to sing opera while being strangled by a piccolo. This was not how conquest was supposed to work. The manual clearly stated that civilizations either surrendered immediately or put up token resistance before surrendering slightly less immediately. There was nothing about zoning laws. There was nothing about departments. There was certainly nothing about forms. "Have they given us any indication of when this review process might be completed?" he asked, clinging to the hope that perhaps this was just some sort of elaborate pre-surrender ritual. "Well, sir, they did send us Form 15C, which is an estimated timeline request form. However, in order to process that form, we need to submit Form 23A, which is a request to request a timeline form. but that form requires 3 supporting documents, including a letter of intent, a statement of purpose, and something called a certificate of non-hostile intent, which needs to be notarized. Notarized? Yes, sir, by a licensed interplanetary notary public. Apparently, Earth has very strict requirements about document authentication. The situation deteriorated further when Earth's media began treating the Zlorthian fleet not as an existential threat, but as an inconvenience roughly equivalent to construction work during rush hour. News anchors reported on the alien invasion with the same tone they used for traffic updates, occasionally mentioning that the massive ships hovering over major cities were causing some delays for air travelers and might want to consider relocating to less congested airspace. Dr. Miranda Clockwork, Earth's most respected astrophysicist, and the only person who seemed genuinely interested in actually communicating with the aliens rather than frustrating them into submission, attempted to establish meaningful dialogue through scientific channels. Her carefully crafted message, transmitted on multiple frequencies and translated into 17 different mathematical languages, was a masterpiece of diplomatic precision that managed to convey humanity's peaceful intentions while simultaneously demonstrating their technological sophistication. The Zlorthians responded by sending her Form 44C, request for formal recognition of superior technological achievement, which needed to be notarized by the same interplanetary notary public they still hadn't found, along with a cover letter explaining that before any meaningful scientific dialogue could take place, she would need to acknowledge their obvious technological superiority in writing, in triplicate, with 1 copy filed with the Department of Conquest documentation. "This is madness," screamed Blixnor during what was now his daily crisis meeting, which had evolved into something resembling a therapy session for conquering aliens who were having existential crises. "We are the Zlorthian Empire. We have conquered 147 worlds. We have technologies that can reshape reality itself. We have weapons that make supernovas look like birthday candles. Why are they asking us for a reference number?" The answer, though none of the Zlorthians realized it, lay in the fundamental difference between their previous conquests and humanity. The previous 147 civilizations had been what galactic anthropologists classified as reasonable. When faced with obviously superior technology and overwhelming force, they had logically concluded that resistance was pointless and surrender was the sensible option. Humans, however, were not reasonable. Humans were the sort of species that would argue with a hurricane, negotiate with gravity, file a complaint against entropy for being too depressing, and once spent 30 years fighting a war because someone had insulted someone else's bucket. When faced with the impossible, humans didn't surrender. They didn't even acknowledge it was impossible. They simply treated it as a particularly annoying Tuesday and got on with their lives. This fundamental misunderstanding came to a head during what became known as the Great Demonstration Incident. Blixnorp, growing desperate to prove Zlorthian superiority and increasingly concerned that his career in conquest might be coming to an embarrassing end, decided to showcase their most impressive technology. He ordered his fleet to perform what the manual called a display of overwhelming technological superiority, which involved rearranging the asteroid belt into a giant arrow pointing at Earth, while simultaneously broadcasting a message in every human language explaining why resistance was futile. The operation took 17 hours, required the coordinated effort of the entire Zlorthian fleet, and consumed enough energy to power a small solar system for a decade. It was, by any objective measure, an impressive feat. The sheer amount of energy required to move celestial bodies was beyond anything in human capability. The precision needed to arrange millions of asteroids into a coherent shape demonstrated technological mastery that should have left humanity awestruck and terrified. Instead, the human response was to complain that the arrow was blocking their view of Mars, demand that the aliens restore the asteroid belt to its original configuration or face a lawsuit for property damage to the solar system, and file a formal complaint with what they called the Intergalactic Better Business Bureau. "They're suing us!" Blixnorp shrieked, waving a legal document that had somehow been delivered to his flagship by a process server who claimed to specialize in interplanetary litigation and had arrived in what appeared to be a modified pizza delivery vehicle. "How is this possible? We demonstrated our godlike power. We showed them the futility of resistance." "Sir," ventured Lieutenant Wimslebury, who had been studying human culture with the desperate intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle made entirely of contradiction, "I believe the humans may have a different interpretation of our demonstration." "What interpretation?" "We moved asteroids. We reshaped the cosmos." "Yes, sir. They're calling it vandalism." The lawsuit, filed by the law firm of Grimson and Associates, specializing in interplanetary tort law, cosmic property disputes, and asteroid-related personal injury claims, claimed damages for unauthorized modification of solar system architecture and demanded not only restoration of the asteroid belt, but also compensation for emotional distress caused by disruption of established astronomical patterns, loss of scenic view, and general inconvenience to navigation systems. Throughout the solar system, the total claim was for $17 trillion, plus court costs, attorney fees, and what appeared to be a demand for the Zlorthians to attend mandatory anger management classes. Blixnorp spent 3 full hours reading the legal documents, during which time his brain attempted to process concepts that simply didn't exist in Zlorthian culture. Property rights to celestial bodies, emotional distress caused by asteroid rearrangement, the idea that someone could actually sue a conquering empire for being too impressive. It was like discovering that mathematics had been wrong all along and 2 plus 2 actually equaled purple. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ship's engines and the sound of his worldview collapsing. "In 200 years of conquest, nothing like this has ever happened. Civilizations surrender. They don't send lawyers." But even worse was yet to come. The humans, having established that the Zlorthians were susceptible to legal pressure, began treating the entire invasion as a corporate merger gone wrong. Earth's governments formed something called the Planetary Defense Legal Team, which consisted entirely of lawyers who specialized in hostile takeovers, and began burying the Zlorthian fleet under an avalanche of injunctions, cease and desist orders, and requests for environmental impact studies. "Your Honor," argued lead attorney Samantha Papershark in Earth's hastily established Court of Interplanetary Justice, which had been set up in the basement of the Philadelphia Convention Center between a comic book convention and a quilting exhibition, "the defendants have failed to provide adequate notice of their intention to conquer our planet. Under Section 47 of the Intergalactic Convention on Civilized Behavior, any entity wishing to assume control of a populated world must first undergo a 6-month review process, including public hearings and citizen feedback sessions." Urduri, the Zlorthian legal representative, Junior Administrative Assistant Bumblethorne, who had been hastily promoted to Chief Diplomatic Officer, despite having no training in law, diplomacy, or dealing with creatures who considered paperwork a form of warfare, could only stammer while consulting a briefcase full of forms that seemed to multiply every time he looked at them. But we have big ships, very big ships, with impressive lights, and intimidating sounds. Size of ships is irrelevant under subsection 12C, responded Ms. Papershark, with the sort of smile usually reserved for sharks who had just spotted a wounded seal floating in a kiddie pool. What matters is proper procedural compliance. Has your client filed the appropriate environmental impact statements regarding the placement of their vessels in Earth's atmosphere? Environmental impact statements? Bumblethorne repeated, his voice rising to frequencies that made nearby court stenographers wince. Certainly, those ships of yours are emitting exotic particles that could potentially affect our ozone layer. We'll need a full scientific analysis, peer-reviewed and published, in at least 3 accredited journals, before we can consider allowing you to continue hovering there. Also, do you have parking permits for those vessels? Parking permits? This is a no-hover zone during business hours. The fine is $50 per hour per vessel, since you've been here for approximately 72 hours with, let me see, she consulted her tablet, 47 ships of various sizes. That comes to approximately $169,200 in parking violations. Bumblethorne looked around the courtroom with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the universe operated according to rules that made quantum mechanics look straightforward. But we're conquering you. Conquest doesn't require environmental impact statements or parking permits. I'm afraid it does on Earth, replied Judge Harriet Hammergavel, banging her gavel with the sort of authority that had cowed corporate executives, tax evaders, and at least one minor deity who had tried to claim diplomatic immunity. Motion granted. The defendants have 72 hours to produce the required documentation or remove their vessels from Earth's airspace. Court is adjourned until Tuesday. Bailiff, please serve the defendants with their citation for improper parking. Back on the flagship, Blixnorp was having what could charitably be called a complete mental breakdown, and what could more accurately be described as the sort of psychological collapse usually reserved for beings who had just discovered that their life's work was not only meaningless, but actively ridiculous. His conquest manual, his precious guide to galactic domination, had become about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a supernova. Every strategy, every protocol, every carefully planned intimidation technique had been met not with fear or surrender, but with forms. The humans had somehow managed to turn paperwork into a weapon of mass frustration, and they were wielding it with the sort of precision that suggested they had been preparing for this moment their entire civilization. "Sir," reported Chief Science Officer Wibblebonk, whose analysis computers had been working overtime trying to understand human psychology and had started showing signs of electronic depression, "I believe I may have identified the source of our difficulties." "Finally!" screamed Blixnorp, his voice breaking like a teenager trying to order pizza while his voice was changing. "What is it? Some sort of psychic resistance, hidden weapons, ancient defensive technology, a secret alliance with beings more powerful than us?" "No, sir. It appears to be a cultural trait they call being really, really annoying when they don't want to do something. That's not a real thing. That can't be a real thing. Things like that don't exist in a rational universe." "I'm afraid it is, sir. Our anthropological analysis indicates that humans have elevated passive-aggressive resistance to an art form. When confronted with demands they consider unreasonable, they don't fight back directly. Instead, they create bureaucratic obstacles so complex and frustrating that their opponents eventually give up and go away. It's actually quite ingenious, in a deeply irritating sort of way." Blixnorp stared at his science officer with the look of someone who had just been told that the laws of physics had been replaced by the rules of a board game designed by a committee of particularly vindictive accountants who had never actually played a board game, but had very strong opinions about how they should work. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to be more terrifying than his earlier shouting, "that we're being defeated by inconvenience? I believe the technical term is malicious compliance, sir. They're following all the rules, but in such a way that the rules become weapons against anyone trying to get things done efficiently." The final straw came when Earth's Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs scheduled a public hearing to discuss the Zlorthian conquest proposal. The hearing, held in the gymnasium of Roosevelt High School in suburban Detroit, was attended by exactly 7 people. 3 members of the school board who had nothing better to do on a Thursday evening, Two reporters from the local newspaper who were hoping this might be more interesting than covering the annual debate over whether the crosswalk light timing was adequate, one extremely confused alien diplomatic attaché, and Mrs. Dorothy Kettlebottom, who attended every public meeting, regardless of topic, because she enjoyed the free coffee and donuts and had strong opinions about municipal governance. The hearing proceeded according to standard municipal protocol, which meant it began 37 minutes late, because the janitor couldn't find the key to the storage closet where they kept the folding chairs, spent an hour discussing procedural matters that had nothing to do with alien conquest, and featured a lengthy presentation by the Parks and Recreation Committee about their new butterfly garden project. When diplomatic attaché Quizzlebuzz finally got his turn to speak, he delivered what he considered a stirring speech about the inevitable triumph of Zlothian civilization and the benefits that would accrue to humanity once they accepted their new role as subjects of the Empire. He had rehearsed this speech for weeks, incorporating dramatic pauses, emphatic gestures, and what he believed were culturally appropriate references to human values like efficiency and order. The response was less than overwhelming. "That's very nice, dear," said Mrs. Kettlebottom, who had spent the entire presentation knitting what appeared to be a sweater for someone with an unusual number of arms. "But what's your position on the proposed bike path extension? That's the real issue facing this community." "Bike path extension?" Quizzlebuzz repeated, his translator struggling with the concept. "Down Maple Street," she continued, not looking up from her knitting. "They want to extend it all the way to the community center, but that means tearing up Mrs. Henderson's rose garden, and she's been fighting it for 3 years. Now that's a real conflict. Are you aliens planning to do anything about that?" The transcript of that hearing, later distributed throughout the Zlothian fleet, became required reading in what military historians would call the fastest civilizational nervous breakdown in recorded galactic history. The idea that beings could listen to a proposal for planetary conquest and respond by asking about bike paths shattered every assumption the Zlothians had about how intelligent life was supposed to behave. Commander Supreme Blixnorp, reading the transcript in his private quarters while consuming what appeared to be the alien equivalent of antacids, made a sound like a deflating bagpipe and seriously considered updating his resume. Perhaps it was time for a career change. Galaxy conquering was clearly not the growth industry it once was, but the worst revelation was yet to come. Dr. Cornelius Bumblebottom, despite his questionable credentials and his tendency to use words that didn't exist in any known language, had been conducting his own investigation into Zlothian conquest methods. Using a combination of intercepted communications, sociological analysis, and what he called educated guessing, he had reached a conclusion that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to Earth's hastily assembled crisis committee, adjusting his bow tie with the sort of dramatic flair usually reserved for people revealing the identity of murderers in drawing-room mysteries. "I believe I understand how the Zlothians conquered 147 worlds without firing a shot." "Odile, please tell me it's not more paperwork," groaned General Ironside, who had been dealing with government bureaucracy for so long that she had developed an involuntary twitch whenever anyone mentioned forms. "Quite the contrary. The brilliance of their method lies in its simplicity. They didn't conquer those worlds at all. They simply convinced them they had been conquered." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning, someone's stomach rumbling, and what sounded like Dr. Bumblebottom's bow tie adjusting itself. "Explain," demanded Secretary of State Jennifer Briefcase, who had been taking notes on everything and was beginning to suspect that this was either the most important moment in human history or the most elaborate practical joke ever conceived. "Think about it," continued Dr. Bumblebottom, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found an audience for his theories about interplanetary psychology. A massive fleet appears over your planet. They announce they're here to conquer you. They demonstrate overwhelming technological superiority. Most civilizations would logically conclude that resistance is futile and surrender immediately. But here's the crucial point. The Zlothians never actually do anything threatening. They just look threatening and wait for everyone to surrender. "You're saying they're cosmic bluffers?" asked Dr. Miranda Clockwork, who had been listening with the sort of fascination usually reserved for people discovering that their pet goldfish had been secretly running a stock trading operation. "Precisely. Their entire empire is built on intimidation and the assumption that reasonable beings will accept the inevitable rather than fight a hopeless battle. It's actually quite brilliant if you think about it. Why destroy planets when you can simply convince them to surrender voluntarily? Much more cost-effective, and you don't have to deal with rebuilding afterward." General Ironside leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the monster under her bed was actually a very polite insurance salesman who just wanted to discuss life coverage options. "So what happens when they encounter beings who aren't reasonable?" "Well," said Dr. Bumblebottom, glancing toward the window where the Zlothian mothership hung in the sky like a very large, very confused Christmas ornament that had gotten lost on its way to the tree, "I believe we're about to find out." The revelation spread through Earth's command structure like wildfire through a library filled with particularly flammable books. The aliens weren't unstoppable conquerors. They were essentially cosmic con artists whose entire strategy depended on their victims being sensible enough to surrender without testing whether the threats were real. Humans, as had been established beyond doubt, were not sensible. The psychological impact on the Zlothian fleet was devastating. Once word leaked that their conquest method had been exposed, centuries of military doctrine collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane being operated by someone who had never seen cards before and wasn't entirely sure what a house was supposed to look like. Across the fleet, Zlothian officers found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about conquest, intimidation, and the fundamental nature of civilized behavior. Some requested transfers to the accounting division. Others locked themselves in their quarters and refused to come out until someone could explain why the universe wasn't behaving according to the manual. A few began writing poetry, which was generally considered a sign of severe psychological distress in Zlothian culture. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Wimselberry during what had become a daily crisis briefing that was beginning to resemble a support group for beings having existential crises, "morale among the troops is at an all-time low. 3 of our junior officers have submitted requests for transfer to the accounting division, and Chief Engineer Wobblebottom has locked himself in his quarters and refuses to come out until someone explains why humans don't follow the manual." Blixnorp, who had aged approximately 30 years in the past week and was beginning to develop what appeared to be stress-related eye twitches, rubbed his eye stalks wearily. "What about the other conquered worlds? Any word from the provinces?" That's part of the problem, sir. Once news of our difficulties with Earth reached the other worlds, they began asking uncomfortable questions." "What sort of questions?" "Questions like, what would happen if we just said no? And are those weapons actually functional or just for show?" Several worlds have requested independence hearings, and the Rigelian system has formed what they're calling a liberation committee. The Centaurians have filed a formal complaint about inadequate customer service during their conquest process, and the beings from Kepler 442b are demanding a refund. A refund? Apparently they feel that their conquest experience did not meet their expectations. They're citing false advertising since we promised them efficient integration into a galactic empire, but they claim all they got was a bunch of forms to fill out and occasional visits from bureaucrats who didn't seem to know what they were doing. The sound Blixnorp made was somewhere between a groan and the noise a balloon makes when it's slowly deflating while someone plays a funeral dirge on a kazoo that's slightly out of tune. His empire, built over centuries of careful intimidation and psychological manipulation, was unraveling because one small blue planet had figured out that the Emperor had no clothes, no weapons, and possibly no actual authority beyond what people were willing to give him. Earth, meanwhile, was handling its role as inadvertent galactic revolutionary with characteristic human adaptability. The Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs had been flooded with applications from other worlds seeking advice on how to tell conquering aliens to buzz off, a practical guide. Dr. Bumblebottom found himself consulting on liberation movements across 17 star systems, while Meredith Crankshaw had become something of an interplanetary folk hero. Her dismissal of the Zlorthian ultimatum was being broadcast on resistance radio stations throughout the galaxy, and she had received fan mail from beings she couldn't pronounce the names of. The Rigelian Liberation Committee had named her their honorary president, and someone from the Vega system had sent her a fruit basket that contained things that weren't technically fruit, but were apparently the local equivalent. "I still don't understand what all the fuss is about," Meredith told a reporter from Galactic News Network during an interview that was being simultaneously broadcast to 47 different worlds. "I've dealt with door-to-door salesmen who were more intimidating than those space people. At least the encyclopedia salesman didn't block out the sun, and they usually had better manners." The reporter, a being that looked like a cross between a giraffe and a filing cabinet, nodded enthusiastically. "What advice would you give to other worlds facing similar situations?" "Same thing I'd tell anyone dealing with pushy salespeople," Meredith replied, sipping tea from a cup that read, "World's Most Tolerant Grandmother." "Just say no. Be polite about it, but be firm. And if they don't take no for an answer, ask to speak to their manager." The final collapse came when the Zlorthian High Command, faced with widespread rebellion throughout their empire and a complete inability to handle one moderately obstinate planet, made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. They called a meeting. Not a conquest, not an intimidation session, not a demonstration of superior firepower, not even a strongly worded ultimatum. A meeting with an agenda and coffee service. The Great Galactic Conference was held in the gymnasium of Roosevelt High School, partly because it was the only venue on Earth large enough to accommodate representatives from 148 worlds, and partly because the humans thought it would be amusing to hold such a momentous gathering in a place that smelled faintly of gym socks, adolescent anxiety, and the lingering aftermath of last week's tuna casserole lunch. The gymnasium had been decorated with banners reading, "Welcome Galactic Delegates," and "Please wipe your feet tentacles, pseudopods." Folding chairs had been arranged in rows, with a small stage at the front, where someone had set up a podium with a microphone that occasionally emitted feedback that sounded like a dying whale. Commander Supreme Blixnorp, who had traded his ceremonial conquest armor for what appeared to be a very uncomfortable business suit purchased from the big and tall section of a store that clearly didn't cater to beings with eye stalks, stood before the assembled delegates with the demeanor of someone who had just realized that his life's work had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the universe actually operated. "Fellow beings," he began, his voice carrying none of its former authority and most of the tremulous uncertainty of someone giving their first public speech while experiencing a severe allergic reaction to the concept of admitting they were wrong. "We are gathered here today to discuss what our cultural analysts are calling a paradigm shift in interplanetary relations." The response from the assembled crowd was about what you'd expect from several dozen recently liberated civilizations, and one planet full of humans who were still trying to figure out why everyone was making such a big deal about saying no to unreasonable demands. "We demand reparations," shouted the representative from Kepler 442b, a being that looked like a cross between a houseplant and an accountant. "And an apology," added someone from the Vega system, whose translator was apparently having difficulty with the concept of righteous indignation. "And better customer service," called out a voice that sounded suspiciously like Meredith Crankshaw, who had been invited as an honored guest and was sitting in the front row with a thermos of coffee and a bag of homemade cookies. What followed was 6 hours of the sort of diplomatic chaos that occurs when beings who have spent centuries assuming they were conquered discover that they had actually just been very politely asked to pretend to be conquered, and that they could have said no at any time. It was like discovering that the scary monster in the closet had actually been the neighbor's cat wearing a particularly unconvincing costume. The Rigelian delegate demanded to know why they had been sending tribute payments to an empire that had never actually done anything to deserve them. The Centaurian representative wanted an explanation for why their planet's resources had been diverted to support a military that apparently existed primarily for show. The delegate from Proxima Centauri asked whether the Zlorthians had any actual qualifications for running a galactic empire, and whether they had considered taking a management course. Through it all, Blixnorp stood at the podium with the expression of someone watching their carefully constructed worldview collapse in real time while being broadcast live to billions of beings across the galaxy. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Wimselbury, stood beside him, taking notes with the enthusiasm of someone documenting the end of the world. The resolution, when it finally came, was both anticlimactic and strangely satisfying. The Zlorthian Empire would be dissolved, effective immediately. Its fleets would be repurposed for interplanetary postal service, because as several delegates pointed out, they were already good at showing up places and making announcements. They just needed to work on their customer service skills. Former Commander Supreme Blixnorp would be retrained as a customer service representative because, as several delegates pointed out with what could charitably be called malicious glee, his experience with dealing with unreasonable demands would be invaluable in that field. "At least," said the delegate from Wolf 359, "when people hang up on him, he'll understand why." The various worlds would form a loose confederation based on the principles of asking nicely, taking no for an answer, and not assuming that bigger ships automatically meant better ideas. Trade agreements would be negotiated through proper channels, with appropriate paperwork filed in triplicate. As for Earth, its role in accidentally triggering the collapse of a galactic empire was officially recognized with a certificate of appreciation and a small trophy that read, "Most Unnecessarily Difficult Planet to Conquer 2024. The trophy was presented by a delegation of grateful beings from across the galaxy, most of whom wanted to shake Meredith Crankshaw's hand and ask for her autograph. The trophy sits in the United Nations building to this day, right next to the coffee machine on the 3rd floor, where it serves as a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to deal with impossible situations is to simply refuse to acknowledge that they're impossible. Dr. Bumblebottom was offered positions at 17 different universities across the galaxy, most of which actually existed. He accepted a teaching position at the Rigelian Institute for Advanced Bureaucratic Studies, where he now teaches courses on the practical applications of administrative resistance and how to defeat superior technology using properly filed paperwork. General Ironside was promoted and put in charge of Earth's new Department of Galactic Relations, which operates on a strict 9-to-5 schedule and requires all visiting aliens to make appointments at least 2 weeks in advance. Meredith Crankshaw, meanwhile, finally got her toaster exchanged for one that didn't require a fire extinguisher to operate safely. The replacement toaster works perfectly and has never once threatened to achieve sentience or declare independence from the kitchen counter. She was also offered honorary citizenship on 14 different worlds, a book deal, and her own talk show. She declined all of these offers, explaining that she had a garden to tend and wasn't particularly interested in becoming famous for doing what any reasonable person would do when faced with unreasonable demands. And somewhere in the cosmos, on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, life continues much as it always has, except that now the humans know that when beings from other worlds show up with impressive ships and demanding attitudes, the proper response is not fear or awe, but a polite but firm request to see their paperwork and proof that they've scheduled an appointment. The universe, as it turned out, was not only stranger than anyone had imagined, but considerably more susceptible to proper administrative procedures than anyone had ever dared to hope.